I am Inspector, and I solve mystery. Welcome to my new case.
The afternoon light in the Sheldonian Theatre held that particular quality of Oxford winter, pale, apologetic, and faintly melancholy, as if the sun itself had taken a first in classics and learned to temper enthusiasm with irony. Morse sat 3 rows from the front, one of perhaps 20 souls scattered through Christopher Wren's octagonal masterpiece, listening to a student consort attempt to coax warmth from Dowland's "Flow, My Tears." The music fell through the December air like leaves, each note a small surrender to the season's inevitable decline. The conductor's podium stood empty. The students had chosen to perform without direction, a democracy of sorrow that somehow suited both the composer and the sparse audience. Morse watched the young cellist, her bow moving with the careful precision of someone who understood that Dowland's airs were less about technique than about the spaces between the notes, the silences where grief lived most honestly. When the final chord faded into the theatre's expectant hush, Morse remained seated as the other listeners filed out with the particular Oxford shuffle, hurried yet dignified, as if lateness were acceptable provided it was sufficiently intellectual. He had nowhere pressing to be, no one waiting with dinner growing cold, only the prospect of his flat and a bottle of claret that had been breathing since Tuesday. In the foyer, he accepted a cup of coffee from an urn that had clearly surrendered any pretensions to quality sometime during the Major government. The Times lay folded on a nearby table, abandoned by some don who had doubtless moved on to weightier considerations. Morse retrieved it and found his way to the crossword, that daily ritual of small victories and private satisfactions. Song kept in comfortable seat. 8, he read aloud, his voice barely audible above the radiator's persistent cough. The clue pleased him with its modest cleverness, not too obscure, not insultingly simple. Armchair, obviously. AR, the song, kept within RMCH. He penciled it in with the satisfaction of a man who understood that life's genuine pleasures were often the smallest ones. The bells of St. Mary's began their ancient conversation with the hour, each bronze voice adding its note to Oxford's perpetual symphony. 4 o'clock, and the light already thinking of departure. Morse sipped his coffee and contemplated the curious democracy of crosswords, how they reduced all solvers to the same fundamental condition, alone with language, seeking the perfect fit between clue and answer. His mobile phone, a concession to strangers' insistence on modern policing, buzzed with the particular urgency that suggested duty calling. The chief superintendent's voice emerged from the small speaker with its familiar blend of Yorkshire pragmatism and barely contained exasperation. Morse? Need you to have a look at something. Anonymous letter came in this morning, addressed to the station. Bit odd. Anonymous letters usually are, sir. What does it say? Just one line. A song played from her favorite chair. Nothing else. No signature, no postmark we can make sense of. Might be nothing, but the duty sergeant thought you'd want to see it. Morse folded the crossword carefully, preserving armchair like a small treasure. Any context? Complaint? Threat? That's just it. No context at all. But it came with a college address on the envelope. St. Wilhelmina's, down by the canal. You know it. He did know it. A small women's college with a reputation for discretion and academic excellence, the sort of institution that produced cabinet ministers' wives and BBC producers with double-barreled surnames. I'll take a look, sir. Lewis is already there, asking preliminary questions. Something about a don who died yesterday. Natural causes, they thought, but now... Stranger's voice trailed off with the particular weariness of a man who had learned to distrust coincidence. Morse pocketed the phone and looked once more at the empty concert hall, its silence now complete. The students had packed away their instruments, leaving only the memory of Dowland's melancholy and the faint echo of tears flowing in D minor. Outside, Oxford's ancient stones waited in the gathering dusk, patient as always, keeping their secrets with the discretion of centuries. As he walked toward his car, Morse found himself thinking of chairs, their silent fidelity, their capacity for holding both presence and absence. A song played from her favorite chair. The phrase had a quality that lingered, like a melody half-remembered from childhood, beautiful and somehow troubling. He drove through the narrow streets toward Saint Wilhelmina's, past students cycling with scarves, streaming like academic banners, past pubs beginning to glow with a promise of warmth and conversation. The crossword lay beside him on the passenger seat, armchair penciled in with confidence, but the anonymous letter's phrase echoed in his mind with the persistence of an unresolved chord. A song played from her favorite chair. Someone, somewhere, had wanted the police to know about a song and a chair. In Morse's experience, when people felt compelled to write anonymous letters, it was rarely because they had nothing interesting to say. Rain had been working at Oxford since morning, not the theatrical downpour beloved of detective novels, but that patient English drizzle that finds its way into stone and bone alike. St. Wilhelmina's College rose from its sodden gardens like a discreet promise kept too long, red brick mellowed to the color of old blood, ivy climbing toward leaded windows that had witnessed decades of scholarly ambitions and private disappointments. Lewis waited at the porter's lodge, his notebook already thick with preliminary observations. The porter himself, a man whose face suggested years of tactful blindness to undergraduate indiscretions, directed us toward the principal's office with weary courtesy. I had the sense that police visits, while not common, were not entirely unprecedented in this corner of academic Oxford. Dr. Margaret Thornley received us in a room that managed to be both austere and comfortable, lined with books that appeared genuinely read, rather than decoratively acquired. She possessed that particular intelligence of someone accustomed to managing brilliant but difficult personalities, and she spoke of Dr. Eliza Hart with the studied calm of those who have chaired too many committees on tragedy. Hart had been found that morning, she explained, seated in her favorite wing-back chair, apparently having died peacefully during the night. The college physician had pronounced it natural causes, heart failure most likely. The bursar, Geoffrey Lomas, joined us with nervous energy, his concern seemingly more institutional than personal. He spoke of Hart in terms that managed to be both respectful and subtly critical. Brilliant, certainly, but difficult in the way that brilliant people often were, particularly those who had never learned the art of compromise. It was Mrs. Dawson, the scout responsible for Hart's staircase, who provided the detail that first suggested something beyond natural death. She had heard music from Hart's rooms the previous evening, she told us, with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to observe without judging. Mournful music, she called it, though she couldn't identify the composer. This struck her as unusual because Hart rarely played her gramophone in the evenings, preferring to work in silence. The study itself occupied a corner of the first floor, its windows offering views of both Quadrangle and the narrow lane separating the college from the canal towpath. The room spoke of a life lived among books and ideas, shelves climbing to the ceiling, papers arranged in systems comprehensible only to their creator, the lingering scent of bergamot tea and old leather bindings. Hart sat in the burgundy wing-back chair before the fireplace, her head angled slightly toward the window as if the garden required one last adjudication. There was no melodrama about it, only a completed sentence. On the side table, a water glass bore the crescent mark that lime leaves for the fastidious. But it was the gramophone that drew my attention, a handsome Edwardian piece, well maintained, its brass fittings polished to gentle gleam. The turntable held a record, Dowland according to the label, and the needle arm rested not in its proper cradle but a fraction's width from the groove, as if an interrupted intention had hardened into silence. No dust shadow marked where careful hands would always return it. Such small domestic betrayals announced themselves quietly to those who notice furniture's habits. Lewis produced the anonymous letter in its plastic sleeve, and I read the single sentence twice, then again, because repetition sometimes sorts signal from noise. A song played from her favorite chair. What struck me immediately was the spelling, favorite rather than favorite, a small Americanism that seemed oddly displaced in this Oxford context. The envelope bore the same transatlantic inflection. These are the small stones in the shoe that make a walk memorable. I walked slowly around the chair, noting how it faced both fireplace and gramophone, positioned to catch afternoon light from the windows. Someone had arranged this room with the precision of a stage set, every element placed for maximum comfort and aesthetic pleasure. On the rug beneath, 2 faint arcs in the pile suggested the chair had been drawn forward and back more often than a woman reading alone would require. As we prepared to leave, I found myself thinking of chairs and the intimate relationships they develop with their occupants, how they hold the shape of a life, the particular way someone sits, dreams, dies. Hart's chair would remember her now in ways no questioning could reveal, a silent witness to whatever had transpired in those final hours. The anonymous letter remained in my pocket, its careful words echoing with the persistence of an unfinished melody, while somewhere in Oxford's ancient stones, someone who spelled favorite without the U waited to see whether their message had found its intended audience. Rain had been working at Oxford since morning, not the theatrical downpour beloved of detective novels, but that patient English drizzle that finds its way into stone and bone alike. The college solicitor's office on Turl Street exhaled the particular mustiness of legal documents and old leather, where lives reduced themselves to their essential transactions under the watchful eyes of portraits whose subjects had long since discovered whether their bequests mattered. Hart's will, dated 18 months prior, proved unremarkable in its modest generosity. Books to the college library, personal effects distributed among friends, charitable donations that spoke of a conscience carefully maintained. But clipped to the back was a handwritten note, dated just 3 days before her death, expressing her intention to establish a memorial scholarship for someone identified only by the initials E.L. What paused me was a courtesy to an older music. She had written air when any sensible person would write Air Dolan's spelling, chosen as one chooses an intimate. I read it twice, then a third time, and noticed the draft envelope beneath keeping its English favorite. By morning, an anonymous letter had arrived without the U. 2 minds had handled one idea. The vowels did not agree. It is sometimes the stray letter that remembers the other hand in the room. Lewis, conscientious as weather, had compiled our cast principles with his usual thoroughness. Professor Adrian Vale emerged from his translations of Catullus, a classicist whose erudition was matched only by his capacity for professional rivalry, the sort of glittering man who fed on argument. The Reverend Mark Pevensey served as college chaplain, courteous, everywhere and nowhere, custodian of keys and conscience alike. Clara Finch appeared as a doctoral cellist, specializing in early English composers, her talent looking almost like defiance against the world's indifference to beauty. Lionel Bright owned an antiquarian bookshop on the High Street, dealing in musical manuscripts and the small hopes that collectors nurture. Finally, Dr. Miriam Kay, a physician at the Radcliffe Infirmary, had maintained a friendship with Hart spanning nearly 2 decades, practical as a metronome and no less attentive. Each name carried its own weight of possibility, its own potential for the kind of complex motivation that transforms academic colleagues into something more dangerous. The musical connections intrigued me particularly. The cellist who would understand the grammar of early music, the chaplain versed in liturgical traditions, the antiquarian who traded in manuscripts, even Vale, whose classical training would encompass the poetry that became Renaissance songs. Hart's study yielded further mysteries when I returned that afternoon, drawn by the nagging sense that rooms speak more honestly in solitude. Tucked within a leather portfolio was a notebook containing drafts of various poems, exercises in formal structure that suggested someone working through grief or confusion in verse. One piece caught my attention. 7 lines written in Hart's careful hand. Competent verse speaking of comfort and memory, of how familiar objects hold the presence of those who have used them. But it was reading lazily, my eye drifting down the left margin without permission, that revealed the poem's true purpose. The initials, each line's first courtesy, stood to attention and resolved neatly into a single word. Armchair. Too deliberate for accident, too playful somehow for despair. I heard, unhelpfully, yesterday's crossword whispering its compact definition. Song kept in comfortable seat. Hart had encoded the very chair in which she died into verse, creating a puzzle that would only reveal itself to careful readers. The connection felt less like coincidence than like the universe's particular sense of irony. Such symmetries make experienced policemen nervous because they suggest either remarkable coincidence or careful planning. Hart made ours. Our correspondent preferred airs. The difference nagged, soft as damp in plaster, while somewhere in Oxford's ancient stones, someone who spelled favourite without the U waited to see whether their message had found its intended audience. Outside, rain stroked the stone as if to remind it of rivers it once refused, and I found myself thinking of chairs and the intimate relationships they develop with their occupants. How they hold the shape of a life. The particular way someone sits, dreams, dies. Afternoon rain had settled into Oxford stones with the patience of centuries, turning the college quadrangle into a study of greys that Whistler might have envied. The interviews awaited in Hart's former study, where death had left its particular silence, not emptiness, but expectancy, as if the room still listened for footsteps that would not return. Professor Vale arrived carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to being the most perceptive mind in any gathering. He settled opposite Hart's wingback with practiced ease, speaking of professional respect tempered by scholarly disagreement, the sort of collegial friction that academic institutions cultivate like rare orchids. When I asked about Hart's character, he reached for poetry, with the confidence of long familiarity, quoting what he claimed was Hausmann. The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise. The lines emerged naturally from his consideration, but something in the rhythm troubled me. Later, consulting my worn copy of A Shropshire Lad, I discovered Vale's improvement upon the original, which speaks of hearts compounded of lies rather than denying such composition. A small liberty, perhaps, but poets earn authority through precision, and misquotation in a classicist suggests either carelessness or deliberate revision to serve present purposes. Clara Finch arrived as daylight began its retreat, her cello case slung like a faithful companion. She possessed that intensity of young musicians who have learned to hear the world differently, and genuine sorrow colored her words when discussing Hart's death. They had shared passion for early English composers, she explained, and Hart had been generous with both encouragement and access to rare manuscripts. The previous evening, crossing the quadrangle, Finch had heard music drifting from Hart's rooms. She thought it might have been Purcell, though she couldn't be certain. Something mournful and complex, requiring careful attention. The music stopped before she reached her own staircase, leaving only the usual college sounds. Heating pipes settling, footsteps on ancient floorboards, undergraduate voices murmuring in distant corridors. Reverend Pevensey appeared with the punctuality his profession demands, speaking of Hart with pastoral care. He described her as a woman of deep feeling who struggled with questions of meaning while maintaining what he called a profound sense of the sacred in music. Their conversations had often touched spiritual matters, though Hart remained skeptical of organized religion. It was Pevensey's casual reference to the Purcell aria that first planted seeds of unease. He mentioned it while discussing Hart's musical preferences, suggesting she had particular fondness for that composer's treatment of melancholy themes. Such precision troubled me. Finch had been uncertain about identification, speaking only of something that might have been Purcell, while the record on Hart's gramophone bore Dowland's name. Retrospective certainty often indicates either exceptional memory or information acquired through other means. When our conversations concluded, I remained in the study as shadows gathered like thoughts reluctant to examination. The wingback chair drew my attention once again, and I found myself circling it slowly, noting details that daylight had obscured. Pressing gently on the chair's arm, I heard it. A sharp squeak from the front caster, a small domestic protest that would announce any attempt to reposition the furniture. Yet the arcs in the carpet suggested frequent movement, as if someone had regularly adjusted placement for optimal comfort or view. The sound was distinct enough to carry through thin college walls, the sort of minor annoyance that neighbors learn to recognize. I thought of Clara's descending melody and Pevensy's confident identification of how sound travels through stone and memory alike. Outside, Oxford's bells began their evening dialogue between time and eternity. In Hart's study, silence held court while three testimonies hummed their discordant notes. Vale's improved Houseman, Clara's uncertain Purcell, Pevensy's definitive aria. Somewhere in the gathering darkness, someone who knew the difference between composers waited to discover whether careful questions had begun finding their proper answers. The squeaking caster seemed to whisper its own small confession about chairs that move and music that plays, while Oxford's ancient stones kept their patient counsel. The rain eased by late afternoon, leaving High Street windows stippled and the air newly polished. Bright's shop sat between a silversmith and a cafe that had changed its name but not its tables. The window held foxed scores and a brass clef that caught what light remained. I pushed the door. The bell made a chromatic sigh. Dust smelt honest, the sort that has lived a long time with paper and music. Bright emerged from the stacks, as if returning from another century, his enthusiasm for rare manuscripts evident in the careful way he handled each volume. He spoke of Hart with genuine respect, describing her as someone who understood the difference between rarity and mere age. The shop exhaled that particular perfume of knowledge preserved against time's appetite, old leather and binding glue creating an atmosphere where secrets might naturally accumulate. In the window, a folio lay open beneath glass, a Purcell songbook, and on the flyleaf in a confident hand, "To E.H. in your favorite chair." A.V., the flourish after the fifth admired itself. Favorite wore its English U as neatly as a porter's tie. I thought of the letter to the station where Favorite had been paired to American Thrift. Symmetry again and friction. I asked about provenance. Bright spoke of a discreet library sale and the usual ghosts. He did not know the donor, or knew too much to say. The ink seemed oddly proud in the downstrokes, not by color but by texture, as if the nib had enjoyed yesterday. An erased pencil price left the paper rough beneath a thumb. I said the dedication was affectionate, rather than compromising. He answered that sentiment, like perfume, lingers on everything and proves nothing. I left him and went to the King's Arms, where tourists were smudging into dons. The manager produced the register with a sigh that had learned resignation. I took a corner and let my finger slide down the columns until a name arrived with offhand neatness. Mr. Briar. 2 nights, the very nights surrounding Hart's death. No address, only a tidy scrawl for the initial. The script was careful not to have character, its very caution a kind of signature. Names that snag at the mind rarely let go. Briar suggested thorn and, faintly, pipe. Only later, with a lukewarm pint, did I see the tiny setter's wink concealed inside it. Briar keeps air much as armchair keeps air. The song housed in the hedge. It meant nothing, and yet twitched the web of the case, the way a spare syllable sometimes shifts a whole line's weight. Vale received me in the senior common room, where sherry functioned as a sacrament and the radiator as a chronic disappointment. I said I had seen a Purcell score inscribed to EH from AV. He replied that AV is a populous monogram, and I must look elsewhere for romance. He had written nothing of the kind. He conceded with a smile trained by a lifetime among footnotes that Hart's chair was excellent for both reading and surrender, and that Purcell preferred late light to disputation. When I asked what he made of affection pressed into a flyleaf, he reached not for Hausmann but for Larkin, and said that what survives of us is love. It was almost right, and therefore wrong. The poem undertakes a wager. What will survive of us is love. Hope, not assertion. Contingency, not creed. The correction was small enough to pass in a drawing room and large enough to matter in a murder. I walked back along Parks Road in pewter light, thinking of inscriptions that lean toward intimacy and names that prefer hedges. The score had spoken tidily in a British U. The letter to us had gone on an American diet. Bright's window steamed with temptation. Briar, if he had slept where the register claimed, had left no address and little else, yet kept his private air within his letters. Vale's denial felt perfectly defensible and faintly theatrical. Purcell hovered at the edge of hearing while the rain began again, a fine mist that made stone look briefly penitent. Oxford absorbs pseudonyms the way damp stone drinks sound, slowly, without fuss, until nothing remains but a trace. The pathologist's report arrived with Morning Post, clinical prose transforming Hart's peaceful departure into something considerably more deliberate. Digitalis glycosides and concentrations that admitted no therapeutic accident. Someone had measured carefully, understanding both botany and dosage. The heart had simply surrendered, overwhelmed by a kindness turned malevolent, death arriving as gently as sleep after difficult reading. I walked toward St. Wilhelmina's through air, washed clean by yesterday's rain, thinking of foxgloves and their ancient duplicity. Behind the chapel, where Victorian sentiment had softened medieval austerity, the garden exhaled winter's particular melancholy. There they stood in neat procession. Foxglove stalks, their purple bells emptied now but retaining the architectural dignity of flowers that understand their own toxicity. Pevensey appeared as inevitably as incense, emerging from the vestry with soil beneath his fingernails and that expression of pastoral serenity that comes from tending growing things. He spoke of the garden as sanctuary, how the work steadied him for weightier duties. I admired the foxgloves with him, noting their stubborn verticality, then bent to examine what rain had not entirely forgiven. One stalk stood shorter than its neighbors, the cut clean where it should have frayed, soil at the base showing recent disturbance. No severed bells lay scattered. Whoever had harvested here understood the difference between pruning and gathering. Dr. K received me at the Radcliffe in a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and institutional discretion. She possessed that particular authority of physicians who know exactly how much truth a patient can bear, keeping the remainder locked away with other dangerous medicines. Professional boundaries still held, she explained, but friendship allowed certain latitudes. There had been a time, she said carefully, when Hart tutored a student too closely. The year was 1983, the girl Elaine Liddell, clever, painfully so, and unpracticed in moderation. Kay's voice found that pitch between duty and grief when she added that the relationship had ended in the student's death and that institutions possess remarkable liturgies for forgetting. She offered no elaboration on method. I requested none. Hart had carried that year like a stone in her pocket, she said, and had lately spoken of reparations that would outlast her. The college archive exhaled the dry sweetness of old paste and paper, air that had been waiting its entire existence for precisely this purpose. The assistant, young, careful, fond of cotton gloves, brought me the diaries from 1983. I opened the volume to find the college's familiar self-regard continuing through seasons of committee minutes arranged like rosary beads. Then a gap where the spine remembered pressure but could supply no text. A page had been lifted with surgical precision, no ragged edges or petal-shaped tears from hurried fingers. The binding thread lay tidy, though a faint sparkle of adhesive caught the desk lamp where someone had redressed the wound. On the facing page that remained, the paper kept a shadow, translucence like skin remembering a ring long removed. At the top margin, where pressure had once rested harder than elsewhere, a pale dent described a single capital letter. I tilted the book toward the light and watched the impression appear and recede. The serif was ambiguous. It might have curved toward an L or tightened into a P. There are moments when absence makes the most eloquent witness. Who excises pages so cleanly? A physician would possess both tools and scruples about vandalizing records. A bookseller would have the knife and nerve, plus old habits of helping paper part without protest. A chaplain would know the diary's location and the hours when archives sleep undisturbed. Digitalis, the fox's glove, slipped its etymology into my thoughts like a gloved hand into darkness. Fingers, measures, pulses counted and amended. Someone had gloved their touch before handling the past, leaving only the gentlest bruise. An initial impressed, a bell removed, a page persuaded to forget. Oxford kept its wet counsel as evening gathered. I left the reading room convinced the missing page had revealed everything it reasonably could, which is to say almost nothing, and quite enough. Evening had drawn Oxford into that particular conspiracy of shadows and lamplight where truth becomes negotiable and confessions arrive like overdue bills. Bright's shop exhaled its familiar perfume of old leather and patient dust, while outside the high street settled into its nocturnal rhythm of footsteps and closing doors. I found him among his manuscripts, polishing a brass letter opener with the devotion of someone who understood that objects, properly tended, outlast their owners. The Purcell score lay between us on the counter like evidence awaiting judgment. He regarded it with the particular sorrow of craftsmen caught in work they cannot defend, then spoke with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment in private. The inscription was his creation, he admitted. Not forgery exactly, but enhancement, the sort of small fiction that transforms curiosity into desire. He had studied 18th century hands until he could reproduce their confident flourishes, and the dedication to heart from Vale had emerged from his pen with practiced ease. Such embellishments were not uncommon in his trade, he explained with weary honesty. Collectors preferred their treasures seasoned with romance, and who suffered when sentiment supplied what provenance lacked. The confident A.V., the affectionate phrasing, even the properly English favorite, had been calculated to suggest intimacy without compromising propriety. He had placed it in his window, hoping Hart would notice and perhaps smile at the imagined connection. But Hart possessed that scholar's eye for anachronism that made authentication her particular gift. When he showed her the score 3 evenings past, she had examined the ink with the attention others reserved for poetry, noting how iron gall ages to brown halos where nibs pause, how genuine affection writes differently than manufactured sentiment. The deception had revealed itself under her scrutiny, like invisible ink exposed to flame. He had visited her study that final evening, he continued, carrying both score and apology. The porter's lodge stood empty, gone for tea or other necessities, allowing him to cross the quadrangle unobserved. Hart received him with the grace of someone accustomed to disappointment, accepting confession and manuscript with equal courtesy. Their conversation had been brief, professional, tinged with the melancholy that accompanies the dissolution of small illusions. She made tea while he explained his motivations. Not greed precisely, but the antiquarian's eternal struggle between authenticity and survival. The shop sustained itself on margins thin as paper. Collectors increasingly demanded stories along with their purchases. He had meant no harm, only the enhancement that transforms mere objects into vessels for human longing. The timeline aligned with mechanical precision. The King's Arms register confirmed Mr. Breyer's presence, his careful signature managing to be both distinctive and forgettable. The manager remembered him as scholarly, quiet, the sort of guest who paid cash and left no impression beyond punctual settlement. Bright claimed to have left Hart at 9. The hotel's time-stamp placed him safely distant when Digitalis would have claimed its victim near midnight. Yet as he spoke, I recognized the particular satisfaction that accompanies solutions too neat for comfort. Here was motive, exposure of fraud, and opportunity wrapped in convenient timing. The emotional mathematics felt sound. Scholar discovers deception, confronts perpetrator, dies for her integrity. But something in the confession's very completeness suggested theater rather than truth, like stage scenery that convinces from a distance but reveals its artifice under examination. The forged inscription explained much while resolving nothing essential. Would a woman of Hart's sophistication die over a minor Purcell folio enhanced with fictional sentiment? I had seen murders committed for less, certainly, but they typically involved passion rather than the careful administration of botanical toxins. This felt like misdirection, elegant as a crossword clue that satisfies momentarily before revealing its inadequacy. Moreover, the broader pattern remained intact. The anonymous letter with its American favorites, the gramophone needle resting fractionally off its groove, the squeaking caster that would announce the chair's movement. Bright's confession addressed none of these details, treating them as coincidental when Morse's experience suggested coincidence was merely conspiracy wearing comfortable clothes. I walked back through streets where Oxford kept its patient counsel, thinking of false solutions and their seductive neatness. The case had shed its most obvious skin without revealing what lay beneath. Somewhere among the spires and quadrangles, the true architect of Hart's death waited to discover whether this convenient scapegoat would satisfy official curiosity. The crossword clue lingered. Song kept in comfortable seat. Armchair contained its air as neatly as Hart's acrostic poem, but the anonymous correspondent, who preferred favorite to favorite, remained at large, spelling their intentions in vowels that refused to align with Bright's careful confession. The bursar's office possessed that particular atmosphere of institutional arithmetic, where ledgers function as both confession and absolution. Geoffrey Lomas arranged his papers with the devotion of someone who understood that numbers, properly managed, could forestall most varieties of chaos. Outside, November rain rehearsed its ancient percussion against mullioned windows. Inside, the college's financial health lay exposed in columns that refused perfect alignment. Hart's proposed memorial scholarship presented complications beyond sentiment. Lomas explained with the careful circumlocution of someone navigating between honesty and discretion. The endowment would require redirecting funds earmarked for his acoustics laboratory. 3 years of cultivation among potential donors suddenly threatened by posthumous generosity. Modern benefactors preferred tangible monuments to abstract remembrance, and his project promised both prestige and measurable enhancement of the college's reputation. The figures told their own story when examined closely. Hart's scholarship for E.L., those initials that haunted her correspondence like a persistent melody, would slice through his carefully budgeted enhancement initiative with surgical precision. I traced the relevant entries with my finger, noting where amendments had been made, numbers adjusted with the kind of optimism that transforms hope into accounting practice. When I mentioned the memorial's intended recipient, Lomas's discomfort manifested in the precise rearrangement of pencils that already lay in perfect order. He spoke of institutional memory and the wisdom of allowing certain chapters to close themselves, confirming that Elaine Liddell had indeed been a student whose promise ended prematurely in 1983. The college had learned discretion in such matters, he suggested, preferring its tragedies seasoned with sufficient time to render them historical rather than scandalous. His knowledge of Hart's daily routines impressed me with its thoroughness for someone claiming minimal personal contact. He described her evening habits with unexpected intimacy, how she positioned her burgundy wingback to catch the last light, her preference for working in silence until late hours, even the chair's distinctive squeak when drawn closer to the fireplace. The sound carried clearly through the building's thin walls, he explained, and had become as familiar as the college bells. Yet this domestic familiarity sat oddly with his earlier claims of professional distance. The squeaking caster that I had noticed during my own examination produced a sharp protest, audible only within the room itself, not through walls, however thin. How does one learn such precise details without regular proximity? The contradiction lingered, like a false note in an otherwise competent performance. Pevensy's alibi had possessed that clerical tidiness that makes skepticism feel ungracious, but Oxford's geography occasionally provides its own testimony. Walking toward the Radcliffe Hospital through streets where afternoon light caught in puddles like trapped amber, I noticed a familiar Morris Minor tucked between newer vehicles in the staff car park. The same faded blue that had caught my attention outside the chapel, complete with its distinctive dent and fading fish symbol. The parking permit bore yesterday's date with an expiration suggesting several hours' residence. I thought of Pevensy's earnest description of cycling everywhere for spiritual discipline, his rejection of mechanical convenience in favor of physical effort and environmental responsibility. Yet here sat evidence of automotive pragmatism, the bonnet still warm beneath my palm, despite the afternoon's chill. When confronted, his explanation arrived with that particular haste of improvisation attempting to pass for preparation. The bicycle had suffered mechanical failure, he claimed, requiring emergency recourse to transportation maintained for extreme circumstances. Dr. K had summoned him for pastoral comfort with a parishioner facing surgery, duties that transcended personal preference for pedal power. The story possessed sufficient plausibility while remaining conveniently unverifiable. Hospital visits, like confessions, occurred within zones of professional discretion where verification became impolite. Yet the timing troubled me. His presence at the Radcliffe coincided precisely with Hart's final hours, creating an alibi that was both perfect and perfectly suspect. Oxford's bells began their ancient dialogue with approaching darkness, each bronze voice adding its note to the city's perpetual symphony. Somewhere among the spires and quadrangles, truth waited with the patience of centuries, allowing small deceptions to exhaust themselves before revealing what had always been visible to those who understood the difference between looking and seeing. Late evening found me at my kitchen table, the Times crossword spread before me like a map to territories I had failed to explore properly. Song kept in comfortable seat. 8 letters. Armchair. I had solved it days earlier with that modest satisfaction reserved for elegant wordplay. AIR, the song, kept safely within the comfortable embrace of arms. But crosswords, like murders, often possess layers of meaning that reveal themselves only to obsessive examination. Hart's acrostic poem had spelled the same word with deliberate precision, each line's initial letter contributing to the architectural whole. 2 puzzles, identical solutions, the same piece of furniture haunting both. Coincidence had become implausible. Pattern suggested intention with the persistence of a melody half-remembered. I dressed and drove through Oxford's empty streets, where amber street lamps cast pools of light and the colleges maintained their dignified slumber. St. Wilhelmina's porter admitted me with weary courtesy, accustomed to police visits at irregular hours. Hart's study waited in moonlit silence, leaded windows creating geometric shadows across carpet and wall. I approached the burgundy wingback with fresh attention, not as furniture but as potential mechanism, remembering how the squeaking caster had announced its movement and the gramophone needle rested fractionally off its groove. The chair's Victorian construction was solid enough to outlast generations, but my fingers detected something foreign beneath the worn velvet, a small rectangular hardness near the right arm that belonged to no original design. Working carefully with my penknife, I opened a seam that showed recent disturbance and discovered a miniature remote control, the sort used for operating garage doors and television sets. Fishing line, nearly invisible as spider silk, ran from the device through the chair's interior framework toward the gramophone. Following its path required patience and my small torch, but eventually I traced the connection to the turntable's power switch. The mechanism possessed elegant simplicity. Weight in the chair kept the remote's button depressed, maintaining silence. Remove that weight through death or departure, and the button would release, activating the gramophone with mechanical certainty. Nested within the chair's padding lay a wafer-thin pressure sensor, ensuring redundancy should the remote control fail. Someone had transformed Hart's favorite reading chair into a musical trigger, guaranteeing that her final departure would be accompanied by whatever record lay waiting on the turntable. The staging was both theatrical and practical. Anyone discovering the body would find Hart seated peacefully while melancholy music played, death appearing as private meditation rather than calculated murder. The anonymous letter's phrase acquired sinister new meaning. A song played from her favorite chair. Not warning, but boast, a poetic claim of responsibility spelled in American vowels. The scout's testimony about hearing mournful music now revealed itself as mechanical consequence rather than Hart's final indulgence in beauty. Yet the record bore Dowland's name, not Purcell's. I thought of Pevensy's confident reference to the Purcell aria during our earlier conversation, his precise identification of music he claimed to have heard only as distant sound through college walls. How does one distinguish composers from such remove, particularly when the actual selection was entirely different? The answer suggested intimate knowledge of the intended performance. Pevensey had known what would play because he had arranged it, positioning the needle with care before departing. His reference to Purcell revealed not exceptional hearing, but exceptional memory. He had remembered his original choice before substituting Dowland's more appropriate melancholy for the final performance. The fishing line showed signs of recent installation, tiny punctures in the upholstery where amateur repair had been attempted. The work was competent but unprofessional, suggesting someone familiar with practical tasks but unaccustomed to furniture restoration. A chaplain maintaining church property might possess such versatility with tools and materials. Oxford's bells began their ancient dialogue with approaching dawn, each bronze voice contributing to the city's perpetual conversation with time. The crossword's elegant solution had provided the key to understanding how music and mechanism had conspired in murder, but the deeper puzzle remained. Who possessed both technical ingenuity and moral corruption necessary to transform a scholar's chair into an instrument of death? The answer, I suspected, wore clerical collar and tended foxgloves with the devotion others reserved for prayer. Morning arrived with that particular Oxford diffidence, light filtered through centuries of academic discretion until even revelation felt scholarly. The college archive had yielded its final secret reluctantly, a photograph tucked between committee minutes like a pressed flower forgotten in a prayer book, its faded colors speaking of 1983 and the weight of unfinished business. 4 figures arranged themselves on the chapel steps with the casual intimacy of shared purpose. Hart appeared younger but recognizably herself, that intelligence already sharpened by experience into something approaching wisdom. Vale stood beside her with confident academic posture, while Pevensey occupied the background with clerical modesty. But it was the 4th figure who commanded attention, a girl of perhaps 19, dark-haired and luminous with that particular beauty of those who burn too brightly for preservation. The inscription on the reverse bore Hart's careful hand. Tutorial Committee, Michaelmas Term 1983, with E. Liddell. The initials that had haunted Hart's correspondence resolved themselves into a name, a face, a tragedy that had waited 40 years for acknowledgement. I thought of Hart's intended memorial scholarship, those mysterious letters E.L. that had puzzled me until this moment. Not a living beneficiary, but posthumous apology. Hart's final attempt to transform guilt into something approaching grace. When I presented the evidence to Pevensey in his chapel office, he received it with the composure of someone who had been expecting this conversation for decades. The fishing line coiled on his desk like an accusation. The remote control device sat beside it with mechanical innocence. Between them lay the photograph, its faded colors speaking of time's inability to diminish certain varieties of pain. I described the chair's hidden mechanism with the precision it deserved. How weight kept the remote's button depressed, maintaining silence, while removal triggered the gramophone with theatrical certainty. The pressure, sensor nested among Victorian horsehair, ensured redundancy. Someone had transformed Hart's reading chair into a musical trigger, guaranteeing her final departure would be accompanied by whatever record lay waiting. His reference to the Purcell aria during our initial interview had revealed intimate knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. The record bore Dowland's name, yet he had spoken with certainty about music he claimed to hear only as distant sound through college walls. Such precision suggested not exceptional hearing, but exceptional memory. He had remembered his original choice before substituting Dowland's more appropriate melancholy. The missing diary page from 1983 bore his signature as well, removed during pastoral visits when Hart's attention wandered elsewhere. The entry had detailed his role in covering up circumstances of Elaine Liddell's death. Not direct involvement, but institutional complicity, the chaplain's traditional function as keeper of inconvenient truth. Hart's memorial scholarship would require public acknowledgement of Elaine's existence, questions about her death, eventual exposure of those who had chosen institutional preservation over individual justice. I produced yesterday's crossword from my pocket, that daily ritual of small victories and private satisfactions. Song kept in comfortable seat, 8 letters. Armchair containing AR, the musical element hidden within furniture's embrace. Hart had encoded the same word in her acrostic poem, creating a puzzle that revealed itself only to careful readers. 2 minds working toward identical solutions, one seeking truth, the other concealing it. The anonymous letter's American spelling had been deliberate misdirection. Favorite, without the U suggesting foreign involvement while concealing domestic complicity. Years of transatlantic correspondence had familiarized him with orthographic variants, and the subtle deception spoke of someone who understood how small details could redirect attention. Pevensey acknowledged the mechanism's ingenuity with professional pride, explaining how musical timing provided appropriate atmosphere for discovery. Hart would be found as she had lived, surrounded by beauty, attended by melancholy, death arriving as naturally as the conclusion of a well-constructed argument. Oxford's bells began their ancient dialogue with approaching noon, each bronze voice adding its note to the city's perpetual conversation with time and memory. In the chapel garden, foxgloves stood in neat rows, purple bells empty now but retaining their architectural dignity, beautiful and deadly as the man who had tended them with such devotion. The chapel held December light like a cupped prayer, stained glass, casting fragments of color across stone that had absorbed centuries of confession and absolution. Pevensey waited in the front pew with hands folded in liturgical repose, the evidence arranged between us on the altar rail. Fishing line, remote device, the faded photograph from 1983, mundane objects transformed by context into instruments of revelation. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone delivering last rites, his voice carrying that particular resonance of pastoral authority, grown comfortable with difficult truths. He had not intended murder, he explained with careful precision, only mercy, The word arrived clothed in clerical gentleness, as if repetition might absolve the mathematics of digitalis and mechanical timing that had transformed Hart's chair into an instrument of death. Hart had been suffering, he continued, not physically but spiritually, burdened by guilt that no amount of institutional forgetting could diminish. The memorial scholarship represented her attempt at public penance, but such exposure would destroy more lives than it could possibly redeem. The chair mechanism had been conceived as kindness. Digitalis, in precise doses, would bring peaceful sleep, while musical accompaniment provided appropriate atmosphere for her final rest. She would be discovered as she had lived, surrounded by beauty, death arriving as naturally as the conclusion of a well-constructed prayer. But his pastoral concern possessed sharper edges when examined closely. The missing diary page from 1983 bore witness to his role in the Liddell affair, not direct involvement in the girl's death, but complicity in its aftermath, the chaplain's traditional function as keeper of inconvenient truths. He had removed the entry during one of many pastoral visits, when Hart's attention wandered toward correspondence or the eternal complications of academic conscience. Elaine Liddell had been brilliant, he said with genuine sorrow, possessed of that dangerous combination of intellectual gifts and emotional instability that Oxford cultivated with unconscious cruelty. Hart's tutorial relationship had crossed boundaries that institutions preferred to leave unmarked. Intimacy disguised as academic mentorship until the girl's fragile equilibrium collapsed entirely. The coroner had been discreet, the college tactful, and time had performed its usual alchemy of transforming scandal into historical footnote. Yet Hart had never forgiven herself, carrying 1983 like a stone in her pocket, and recent months had brought what she called a moral reckoning. The memorial scholarship would require public acknowledgement of Elaine's existence, questions about her death, eventual exposure of those who had chosen institutional preservation over individual justice. His own complicity would emerge. The diary page, the covered tracks, decades of comfortable silence purchased with a young woman's erasure. The foxgloves had provided both method and metaphor, their purple bells beautiful and deadly as the man who tended them with such devotion. He knew the precise dosage required, having ministered to parishioners whose hearts required pharmaceutical encouragement. The fishing line came from parish hall repairs, the pressure sensor from a retired burglar alarm, threading through Victorian horsehair with the same needle he used to mend altar linen. His reference to the Purcell aria during our initial interview had revealed knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. The record bore Dowland's name, yet he had spoken with certainty about music he claimed to hear only as distant sound through college walls. Such precision suggested not exceptional hearing but exceptional memory. He had remembered his original choice before substituting Dowland's more appropriate melancholy for the final performance. The anonymous letter's American spelling had been deliberate misdirection, he admitted with faint satisfaction. Years of transatlantic correspondence had familiarized him with orthographic variants, and the subtle deception spoke of someone who understood how small details could redirect attention from domestic complicity toward foreign involvement. He possessed keys to every college building, access to private spaces where pastoral duties created their own justification. The musical timing had been calculated for maximum effect, the scouts' rounds, the porter's schedule, the natural rhythms of college life that would ensure discovery at the proper moment. His pastoral care had turned vengeful, not through sudden passion but with the cold precision of someone defending decades of careful construction. Oxford's bells began their ancient dialogue with approaching evening, each bronze voice adding its note to the city's perpetual conversation with time and forgiveness. In the chapel's colored light, Pevensey waited for whatever absolution earthly justice might provide. While somewhere among the spires and quadrangles, Hart's chair sat empty and patient, a silent witness that could not be subpoenaed. The college performed its ancient alchemy with practiced discretion, transforming scandal into regrettable incident through careful application of institutional memory. Committee minutes recorded revised recommendations. The memorial scholarship metamorphosed into something safely generic, a bursary for promising musicians whose names would trouble no one's sleep. The principal's statement spoke of tragic circumstances and lessons learned, while the bursar quietly redirected funds toward projects that promised measurable enhancement without uncomfortable questions. At Hart's memorial service, 12 minutes between opening hymn and closing blessing, Vale read from Larkin with that confident authority he brought to all literary occasions. "What will survive of us is love," he proclaimed, the substitution arriving so naturally that few noticed the poet's original wager, transformed into comfortable certainty. Hope had been promoted to doctrine because doctrine sings more easily than doubt, and institutional voices require harmonious conclusions. The turf received Lewis and me with its familiar conspiracy of low beams and honest ale, where centuries of academic indiscretion had been diluted into comfortable darkness. He nursed his pint with characteristic thoughtfulness, turning Pevensy's confession over like a theological problem requiring careful examination. Was it inevitable, he wondered aloud, this particular collision of guilt and self-preservation? Hart's burden from 1983, Pevensy's complicity in erasure, 40 years of careful silence finally demanding its reckoning. Perhaps tragedy had been waiting since that missing diary page, patient as Oxford stone. I considered the mathematics of inevitability while my fingers found the Times crossword folded in my jacket pocket. Individual choices accumulate like sediment until their weight becomes unsustainable, I told him. Hart could have left Sleeping Truths undisturbed. Pevensey might have accepted exposure with clerical grace. Yet neither had chosen the easier path, and their collision produced consequences no amount of institutional discretion could entirely erase. Song kept in comfortable seat, 8 letters. The clue had waited through 3 weeks of paperwork and testimony, patient as the mystery it had helped unlock. Armchair. I penciled it in with renewed appreciation for the setter's elegant wordplay. AIR, the musical element, kept safely within the comfortable embrace of arms and support. Hart's acrostic poem had spelled the same word with deliberate precision, creating a puzzle that revealed itself only to careful readers. The solution pleased me with its compact symmetry, how 7 letters could contain both furniture and music, comfort and conspiracy. We spoke then of chairs and the intimate relationships they develop with their occupants, how objects absorb the shape of lives lived within their embrace. Lewis observed that furniture outlives affection, and I found myself agreeing. We furnish our hours with things that promise permanence when feelings prove fragile, keeping faith with wood because wood keeps faith with time. Hart's burgundy wingback would remember her in ways no questioning could reveal. The particular pressure of contemplation, the weight of decades-old guilt, the final surrender to mechanical mercy. Oxford's bells began their evening dialogue as we prepared to leave, each bronze voice adding its note to the city's perpetual conversation with time and memory. I walked back through streets where December rain had washed the ancient stones clean, thinking of chairs that hold secrets and crosswords that contain their own solutions. Hart's study waited in gathering darkness, the door still bearing her nameplate like a promise kept too long. The burgundy wingback sat positioned to catch afternoon light from windows that had witnessed decades of scholarly ambitions and private disappointments. Stripped of its hidden mechanism, the chair had returned to simple function, leather and horsehair, wood and springs, waiting with Victorian patience for whatever occupant the college might eventually provide. I pressed gently on the chair's arm and heard the familiar squeak from its front caster, that small domestic protest which had announced movement and betrayed careful staging. No music rose to meet it now. The gramophone sat silent in its proper corner, needle resting in its cradle where it belonged. Silence held court, while Oxford hummed its thin, eternal air through corridors where centuries of human drama had been absorbed into stone and institutional memory. The chair held its peace as Oxford held its secrets, completely, permanently, and with the dignity that comes from understanding some silences prove more eloquent than confession.